So first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to attend this discussion, this interview. We are going to start in a couple of minutes. So if you allow me, I'm just going to refer mainly to those who are students in the Split 50Q or PSC 154I, who are taught by myself and Professor Judek. Just remember that this interview can be used for your midterm that will take place on Monday, March the 9th. So, in fact, you should be here just to enjoy the discussion, but you can just kill two birds with a stone and take advantage, because some of the questions that will be discussed here, you can use them in your midterm, okay? So, in a couple of minutes, we will start. In case you haven't done it yet, make sure that you write your name down in the respective form. There's one form special for the Split 50Q and another one for the PSC, no, the same one for the PSC 154I. Those who are coming from other classes, you please write your name down as well in the other forms. Okay, so let's start. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. It is a real pleasure to welcome Professor José del Valle back to Hofstra University for the third time, which is already a sign of how much we value his presence and his work. José is professor in the PhD programs in Latin America, Iberian and Latino cultures, linguistics, and urban education at the CUNY Graduate Center here in New York. He's one of the most influential scholars working today on language ideology, the political history of Spanish, and the complex relationship between language, nation, and power. Over the past 2 decades, his work has fundamentally reshaped how we understand Spanish, not simply as a linguistic system, but as a historical and political movement, construct. Among his many important contributions are edited volumes such as La Lengua Patria Común, Language, the Common Homeland, Ideas and Ideologies of Spanish, 2007, which challenged essentialist narratives about Spanish and national identity. Also, before that, The Battle Over Spanish, first published in English in 2002 and translated into Spanish in 2004. Another key work he edited, A Political History of Spanish, The Making of a Language, was first published in English by Cambridge University Press in 2013 and later expanded in Spanish editions. That book, in particular, has become indispensable for anyone interested in how Spanish was institutionalized, standardized, and naturalized as a national language. I have had the privilege of participating in the most recent Spanish edition, which makes today's conversation especially meaningful for me and for all of us, obviously. On a personal note, I first met José in 2007 when I audited his graduate seminar, Language and Nation, at the CUNY Graduate Center. At that time, I was an assistant professor here at Hofstra. I studied at Hofstra in 2005. That seminar and reading his work gave me a profound intellectual reassurance that it was possible to build an academic career studying the history of language and literature from a political and cultural perspective. It helped clarify for me that language is never just grammar. It is always entangled with power, identity, and institutions. His most recent book, Lo político del lenguaje, Travesía por el español y sus malestares, The Political Nature of Language, A Journey Through Spanish and Its Discontents, 2024, continues this trajectory. Written with precision and critical depth, the book invites us to think carefully about what it means to say that language is political, not in a superficial sense, but structurally and historically. José's scholarship has received wide international recognition, including the Friedrich Wilhelm Bessel Research Award from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, which he received in 2010 in recognition of his outstanding research accomplishments. But beyond the awards and publications, what I value most about José is his intellectual generosity. He combines rigor with clarity, theoretical depth with accessibility. He's critical without being doctrinaire, and brilliant without ever being pompous. That combination is rare. Today, rather than listening to a formal lecture, we will have the opportunity to engage him in a conversation about the political nature of language and how the broader question of how and when words become power. José, it's a real privilege to have you with us again. Thank you for being here. Please join me in welcoming Professor José del Valle. Can you hear me well? Yes, perfect. So let's start with the first question, José. So could you tell us a little bit about the academic trajectory that made this book possible? How did you become interested in the politics of language?
Well, before answering the question, I want to say thank you for that beautiful introduction. I am delighted to be back at Hofstra. It's the third or even the fourth time. I certainly feel at home here. And it's always been a wonderful experience in this same room, actually. Last time I was here, it was in this same auditorium. So it's always been a very productive and enjoyable experience. So thank you. Thank you very much to all of you for having made this possible. I became interested in studying language when I was an undergraduate in Spain back in the 1980s. I frankly do not know why. I do not know what led me to choose that particular pathway. That may have been a reason. It might not be an intellectually justification, but I chose to study language, at least at an intuitive level. There was something about language that somehow coincided with my concerns about social organization, social inequality, political life. Now, the training I received in Spain was deeply rooted in philology and positivism. It's a type of training that I am delighted to have had. Mm-hmm. Because it allowed me first to objectify language, to look at certain experiences, certain social experiences with a certain distance. So, that framework allowed me to do that. So there is what I want to underline this, because there is on the one hand a personal motivation. There is something happening around me that triggers an interest in language. But an intellectual approach to those experiences requires a certain distance, right? And what I learned in college provided me with the tools to put the distance between myself as a scholar, as a researcher, and those social experiences. I'm not talking about a complete separation, right? But that play between distance and proximity is crucial. Now, what happened when I came to the States in the late 80s, was that I pursued the study of linguistics at the master's level and at the PhD level, and became familiarized with social linguistics. So that was new to me when I arrived in the United States. And what was social linguistics all about? Well, it was about studying correlations between social categories and linguistic forms. So you observe there is linguistic variation, and social linguistics provided you with tools to identify correlations between social categories and linguistic forms, certain linguistic varieties. So I started to integrate my training in philological approaches to language with my training in social linguistics. As a result of that, I wrote a dissertation on variation and change in Old Spanish. And I was combining both these approaches, the philological approach and the social linguistic approach. But as I was pursuing my PhD, I did my PhD at Georgetown University in the early 90s. And in addition to my training in social linguistics, I also had to take a series of courses in discourse analysis. Georgetown at the time, discourse analysis was mainly conversation analysis through very important people like Deborah Tannen, author of You Just Don't Understand Women and Men in Conversation, for example, Heidi Hamilton, Deborah Schifrin. So I acquired tools for the analysis of discourse through that particular school, conversation analysis. That's just one of the many schools through which you can approach the analysis of discourse. But in addition, doing my PhD provided me with the opportunity to take courses outside the department, and I was always somewhat interested in philosophy and literary theory. So it was through those courses that I became familiar with critical theory, right? With critical theory and with a set of authors associated with critical theory. So in addition to the Frankfurt School, I became familiar with the work of Antonio Gramsci, with the work of Pierre Bourdieu, sort of with the French philosophers of deconstruction like Derrida, Michel Foucault. So this is what happens. This is around 1993, 1994. I am doing research for my dissertation. So I'm working on studying changes that are happening in Old Spanish and how these changes that are happening in the language have to do with the social linguistic configuration of the Iberian Peninsula. So I see, through my work, I see there is this connection between language and society, right? But I'm also in pursuit of this interest of mine, right, in critical theory, and I realized that all these folks, Gramsci, Bourdieu, Foucault, Derrida, were theorizing language in a way that opened a space not just for correlations between language and society, but also for the interaction between language and politics. So this is, as a result of this, I said, all right, let me finish the dissertation as I conceived it. And once I finished my dissertation in 1994, I started thinking about how to develop a theoretical framework, a conceptual framework that would allow me to look at certain sociolinguistic phenomena in which I could only understand fully if I brought the notion of the political into the fray.
And related to this theoretical framework, the term glottopolitica, glottopolitics, has become well known largely through your work in New York City, as well as through scholars in Latin America, such as Elvira Narvaja Dernu at the University of Buenos Aires and Darío Rojas in Chile, and many others. The term is now widely used in Spain as well. It has expanded significantly. Could you explain what glottopolitics is exactly, and how it differs from critical sociolinguistics or cultural studies?
Okay, I'll do my best. Glottopolitics, in Spanish, glottopolítica. It's exactly the same as saying the politics of language. Exactly the same. Difference being, well, when we use glottopolitica, glotto, right, refers to the Greek etymon, glossa, right, which was the Greek word for language, in contrast with the Latin word, which was lingua. That's where language comes from. So the politics of language and glottopolitics is the same. It is the same to me, right? In fact, when I finished my PhD around 1994, I become familiar with one collection that had been very recently, back then, created within Routledge. And it was called the Politics of Language series. And I said, there we go. This is it. It's the Politics of Language. So there is a set of authors that are published there. So you have a set of studies, right, that look at certain topics and look at certain topics in a particular way. So you can make the inference of, okay, what's the politics of language? It's what these folks do, right? So it's sort of empirical, right? So, okay, there's this publishing company, there are these scholars, and they promote studying these topics from this perspective. All right, so we're going to call this field the politics. They're calling this field the politics of language. So in Spanish, I was saying la política del lenguaje. That's what I was using back then. And then in the early 2000s, I came into contact with Professor Arnoux at the University of Buenos Aires. And they were doing, her team and Professor Arnoux were doing something very similar to what I was doing with my back then small group of collaborators at CUNY. But they called it glottopolitica. They used the term glottopolitica. I will not go into the history or the etymology of that term, but they had taken it from a group of French sociolinguists who in the 1980s had advanced this term, glottopolitique, in an article entitled Pour la glottopolitique, which I have translated into Spanish. It's available online. And the idea was that the idea behind the proposal of this term was the same as the idea behind the proposal of the politics of language. There is a way in which language and politics are connected that is grounded first in a performative theory of language. Language not as structure, but as action, as social practice. So what's characteristic of glottopolitics or the politics of language is that language is not theorized as a structure, as a system, but rather as a social praxis. And the political does not refer simply to institutional politics, to party politics, to unions, to elections, but rather to the politics of everyday life, meaning every instance in which, through social practice, political subjectivities are being activated in a struggle over power and influence, access to resources. So this required kind of a theoretical tour de force. Right? It required engaging critically with the mainstream theory of language within linguistics, but it also required stepping into the territory of political science and political philosophy, and with care, since I was not an expert in political science, drawing from the discussions that political philosophers were having around the notion of politics.
Okay. As we all know, Spain has an official language for the whole state, which is Spanish. We need to refer to the Spanish Constitution, 1978, the Article 3rd. The Article 3 has 3 parts. The first one says, more or less, that Spanish is the official language of the whole state, and that every Spaniard has the duty and the right to use it. Okay, so the second one indicates that there are other, regional languages that will be official or co-official in their respective territories, depending on the politics of the Estatutos de Autonomía, their code of laws, and then that these languages, the third part, are, deserve a special treatment because it's a sort of a cultural wealth, cultural beauty of the state. Now, related to this, so at this moment we have an official language, Spanish, but we have other co-official languages, which is Galician, Basque, Catalan, and Aranese. So let's see. Do you think that if there were a course on the different languages of Spain taught throughout the Spanish state, monolingual Spanish speakers might become more informed and some linguistic tensions might be alleviated?
Well, as scholars, we don't do might, but as regular folks, yeah, we do might all the time. It might. I would support it. I think it would be good if throughout Spain the language education of Spaniards included significant knowledge of the different languages and varieties spoken throughout the state. I think it would be very positive if Spaniards better understood what linguistic variation as well as multilingualism entails. Both the benefits of diversity and multilingualism as well as the challenges. Mm-hmm. So I would be in favor of a language education system that included not just learning the grammar of standard Spanish, but that was much broader and included a metalinguistic understanding of how language and languages work. Would this lead Spaniards to be more tolerant of diversity? Probably. Would this help solve the political entanglements that result from the coexistence of Spanish nationalism, Galician nationalism, Catalan nationalism, Basque nationalism? I don't think so, but maybe.
So related to this, could you discuss the glottopolitical dimensions of the debate over whether to call the language Spanish or Castellano?
Mm-hmm. It's a funny thing, isn't it? You have a language with two names, right? And it's an interesting empirical question, right? To say, okay, does it matter? Do they use them, one or the other without any significant difference? And the fact is that in most instances, whether a person or a collective chooses to use either Castellano or Español means something. No? It usually points at an attitude towards what the language symbolizes. Now, in terms of historical legitimacy, they're both historically legitimate, right? Castellano and Español, Castilian and Spanish, coexist, at least from the 16th century, right? By the way, it's important to underline the fact that here we're discussing Castellano and Español as synonyms, all right? So it's not that Castellano refers to one particular variety of Spanish that is spoken in central Spain, right? That could be, and in fact, certain people use it in that sense. They say, no, Castellano is the variety spoken in Castile, in central Spain. But what we're talking about here is, say, Chile or Argentina, where people refer to the language they speak as Castellano, right? So obviously they're not referring to the variety spoken in Castile. They're referring to the language as spoken in Chile or Argentina. Right? So when you look at the history of this vibrato, right, of this coexistence between Castellano and Español, what you see is that it has been made productive in different ways. Now, there is a certain point, 17th, 18th century, where Castellano is a term that is associated with people from country folk, whereas Español seems to index urban people. Now, after the independence, after the 1810, 1820, there are certain new nations in what we now call Latin America that choose to use Castellano because Español, right, is formally linked to España. So they choose Castellano in order to separate themselves formally through this symbolic use of the word from España. All right? And then you have a different point in history, which is Spain after the law of political reform and the approval of the Spanish Constitution of 1978. The situation in the late 70s and 80s what the following. Español, right, is used either by Spanish nationalists, right? They promote the use of the word Español, Spanish nationalists, mostly right-wing, and Catalan, Galician, and Basque nationalists. Whereas the rest, this is a generalization, but it's fairly good. The rest of the population refers to the language as Castellano. All right? So people who have if back then, if you heard someone use the term Castellano to refer to the language, he was probably a left-leaning person. If they used Español and they were from, say, Castile or Andalusia, they were probably right-wing. However, if this was happening in Catalonia, Galicia, or Euskadi, if they used Español, they were likely to be Catalan, Galician, and Basque nationalists. Why? Because they said, no, yeah, Español. It's the language of Spain, but we're not Españoles.
An interesting and potentially useful question for some students. So on page 93 of your book, you quote an author called Lodares. So in page 93 of this book, and I quote, Lodares says, "We tend to consider languages as related to spirit and culture. Yet for some time now, they have served as powerful raw materials for industries typical of our era," end of quote. So the question is, does this suggest that concepts such as cultural nationalism, the intimate relationship between language and nation, or Volksgeist, in German, the spirit of the people, does this suggest that these concepts were naive or simply products of a specific historical moment? And what would you say to someone who argues that defending minority languages in and of itself makes little sense, that we should instead focus on the welfare of speakers, and if speaking their language offers no economic advantage, why defend it? I'm being deliberately provocative here.
Okay, that's a doctoral exam question. All right, let's take one at a time. Was it naive to link language to an ethos, a culture? No, it was not naive. It's a product of historical conditions, right? That mapping of language onto certain philosophical, cultural, political categories is the product of specific needs of certain spaces under specific historical circumstances. And I will reiterate the historicity of language and these configurations, right? These associations between language and categories, whether they are philosophical, cultural, social, these are always historical, right? So we should not try to propose universals that explain the mapping of language onto social categories. Let's look at that historically, what's happening there. What are the conditions under which these people say, yes, this language embodies the spirit of these people. Right? We need to study that historically. I think that's crucial. I think that's a significant mistake, a significant error in good part of the literature that debates the legitimacy of specific configurations. In whose interest? Cui bono? That's what I like to look at. Right? You look at specific historical circumstances in which these groups claim that this language is the embodiment of one particular culture, and that on the basis of this coincidence between language and culture, we are a political subject and we are entitled, right? We have the right to decide our political future. That is not that's not a universal principle. That happens under specific historical conditions. Okay, and who's going to benefit from that? That's my take on this type of problem. There is a Canadian and Swiss scholars, you know, Alexandre Duchesne and Monica Heller, who have suggested a very interesting framework. They say, all right, well, what we see in modernity, especially after the 18th century, is we see this constant game, discursive game, that consists of associating certain languages or certain ways of speaking with categories, which themselves are associated either to economic profit or to cultural pride. Right? Their book is called Pride and Profit. Right? The book is called Pride and Profit, Language in Late Capitalism. And I think that's a very productive approach, because one of the empirical findings that surprised me when I started conducting research on the development of Spanish nationalism, I expected certain nationalist movements to have developed discourses that associated language to culture, pride, and others to be more pragmatic. And what I found when I looked at it historically is that they use them they use all of it, depending on what's good at this particular time in order to accomplish those goals. Right? So you see, you find pride and you find profit in all discourses to different degrees. And what seems to determine the different degrees to which you mobilize pride or you mobilize profit? Well, the specific political conditions of that moment. All right, I'm going to win the elections if I go with profit. All right, they're going to go with profit, which is what Lodares is doing, right? Juan Ramón Lodares, this gentleman that I quote in the book and that Vicente referred to, he is participating in a very intense debate within Spain over the importance of supporting minoritized languages, right? And he's saying, well, those minoritized languages are important to, for emotional reasons. So there are a few people who feel those languages are important to them. All right, fine, that's very beautiful, but Spanish is the language with which you're going to make money. That's the argument he's making. And that leads me what I believe was the second part of your question, right? Let me see how I put this. I don't judge morally the strategies that minoritized groups use to mobilize their language politically, right? As a scholar, what I try to do is understand dynamics, understand the dynamics of relating language and linguistic practices to the construction of political subjectivities. So when you look at minoritized groups in Europe, such as Galicians, I am Galician myself, Catalans, Basques, when you look at minoritized groups in the United States, when you look at the indigenous peoples of the Americas, you find a plethora of articulations of language and culture, of language and political subjectivity. And frankly, I have not been able to discern a universal rule. This type of mobilization of language is going to be better than that other. No. Why? Because it's historical, right? And I'm not going to pass judgment on what one specific group decides to do. They'll have to judge it themselves after the fact. Was it successful? That particular mobilization of language in that particular context helped you achieve what you wanted to achieve politically? That's the question.
In your academic production, how important is the prestige of the press where you publish? At the same time, your writing style is clear and accessible. So I recommend that you try, if you haven't done it yet, to read Professor del Valle's scholarship. It's very approachable for everyone, even though it has occasionally been described as pedantic or pretentious, which I don't agree. Do you believe scholars have an obligation to write as clearly as possible? And in that regard, could you reflect on your experience reading authors such as Jacques Derrida, whom you have mentioned and whom you mention in your book?
Oh, that's like 7 questions right there. All right. How important? Well, the first one was about how important is it to publish with Cambridge University Press or with Routledge or with Oxford University Press? Well, I have to say that at the beginning of my career, it was very important, right? Especially in the early stages of your career as a scholar. There are 2 determining factors. One is the need to secure your job, to get tenure. So, yeah, you do need to publish in refereed journals, and if you can place a book in Duke University Press or Cambridge University Press, all right, the better. So that's a need, right? You need to secure your job. And the second is a desire. It's sort of a narcissistic desire to be liked, to be admired by your peers. And that usually, in the early stages of your career, goes hand in hand with publishing in prestigious, fancy publishers. Yeah? So, to early career scholars or students who are thinking of becoming scholars, I'd say, yeah, it's important. Keep an eye on where you publish in the early stages of your career. Once you are relatively free from that need and that desire, although certain people, well, never feel a need to liberate themselves from those, and that's fine. That's fine. But if you are free from those, then in my experience, that liberated me, allowed me to plan who do I want to talk to build my intellectual networks in a freer manner, right? And at that point, that my choice of a publisher was connected to the publics, the audiences that I wanted to reach, right? So at that point, I was not concerned about whether that publisher was going to make it more likely that I would become a full professor or not, right? Or that, my colleagues would think that I'm, so amazing because I publish here and there. But rather, I was motivated more strongly by, I hope those folks read my work. And what else?
Yeah, the style.
The question of style. No, I don't think, I would say no to your question of, do academics have the obligation to write clearly? No. Scholars have the obligation to communicate with the discourse community of which they are part. So you have to understand that there are certain fields of knowledge production that are quite restricted, and they're going to have a language of their own, and it's necessary for the development of that field for those people to develop a language of their own, which ends up being sort of this cryptolect, right? That nobody gets there. So the question is, who do you want to reach, right? Who do you want to reach? It's not like there is just one style, right? we are in possession of a multiplicity of registers and styles, which in your case, in my case, may be multilingual even, right? So I think it is important as scholars that we think, okay, who do I want to talk to? Who am I talking to? We have to be a little less egocentric. I think we have to think more, well, certainly me, I'll speak for myself. I have to be more aware of who am I talking to. And I must tailor the language that I use to the people that I'm talking to. I think that when you formulate, should I stop?
No. I was just checking the time.
All right. I think that when you formulate that question, you're thinking of something that happened to me. In 2016, a Spanish translation of my political history of Spanish was published in Spain by a small independent publisher. And I was interviewed by a journalist from an extreme right newspaper, right? And sort of the political stance of the book leans towards the left. To put it in simplified terms. The point is that this online newspaper, El Confidencial, extreme right, published this interview. And obviously the opinions that I voiced with regard to the political organization of Spain, the status of the different autonomous communities, the ideal language policies, well, they don't align with the right, much less with the extreme right. Issues such as language and gender, for example, that I was asked about, also don't align with conservative positions or extreme right positions. So what happened was that, of course, this is an online newspaper, so you can imagine the comments section, right? The most important thing about that whole, what I cherish about that whole episode was the comments, you know, the insults, the vitriol in that section. So, I mean, my first reaction was, whoa, you know, I was impacted by the insults, some of them borderline threats. And basically, my initial reaction was, these are just these fascists, right? To just dismiss the whole thing as all these fascists, which many probably are, right? But as time went by, I started engaging differently with that, right? And I said, okay, let me see what's there. And I realized that, remember what I was saying earlier about a certain distance with respect to the object of study? Okay, I was able to do that after the initial emotional reaction. And I realized that in addition to insults and aggressions and verbal aggressions, there were some ideas there. There were some ideas. Most of them incorrect, but they were ideas, right? So let me give you one example, right? I had stated in the interview that the dominance of Castile throughout the Middle Ages had resulted in Spanish becoming the dominant language. And this, in turn, had resulted in sort of the cornering of Catalan and Galician. And one person wrote there, Spanish became the dominant language because it has a much clearer phonetic system. Right? The vowels of Spanish are much more powerful than the vowels of Galician and Catalan. All right, so this is not an insult. This is an idea, an incorrect representation of the phonetic system of Spanish in relation to Catalan and Galician. And I realized that why does this? Where did he get this? Well, he got it from one of the most important textbooks on the history of Spanish, published in 1926, Orígenes del Español, The Origins of Spanish. So this man, I very much doubt he had read Orígenes del Español, but he had taken a class in which his professor, who had studied philology, had read that book. So this is very important information in order to understand, all right, how do ideas circulate throughout society? Right? Why is it important for us as scholars working on the history of the language to engage with that tradition, to engage critically with that tradition? But it's also important not only to engage with that tradition, it's also important to give an interview to a newspaper and question those incorrect ideas. What was my mistake? When I gave this interview, I spoke as if I was speaking to colleagues in academia. And that's why all the folks were calling me a pedantic bastard. And they were right, in a way. What they were saying is, you're not speaking to me in the way that I would expect you to speak to me, right? The language, the register that I was using indexed a university professor who is not in contact with the real world, who is a pedantic piece of shit, right? My fault. I should have known better. I'm giving an interview to an extreme right newspaper, all right? They would have probably insulted me anyway, right? But I might have been able to reach certain people and listen to my explanation of why the vocalic system of Castilian and its contrasts with that of Catalan have nothing to do with the Spanish becoming the dominant language of the Iberian Peninsula.
Anyway, so before you ask all those questions that I know that you are looking forward to asking, I'm just gonna, pose the last question. I have many more, but the last question now. So finally, what is your view on the autonomy of Spanglish as defended by some scholars?
What I have seen, and I have devoted a significant part of my research time to the politics of language in the United States. I have published little about it, but I have mobilized that research mostly in my doctoral seminars. What I have seen is that the word Spanglish is indeed used in certain contexts to refer to certain linguistic practices that include elements canonically associated to English and other elements canonically associated to Spanish. So that's point number one. That you asked me for my views. That's one of the things I see, right? That's one of the things I see, that there are certain people who use that word in order to refer to these practices. But I also see that the word associated to those linguistic practices has different, let's call them connotations, right? Has different implications. It indexes or it points at different attitudes towards those linguistic practices. So what I have found is that in the Latinx intellectual field, in the complex, barely noticeable at times Latinx intellectual field, or fields, better in the plural, there are some folks that use that sign, Spanglish, right, referring to those practices as a token of Latinx identity. They embrace it with pride. They say, yes, these linguistic practices are one of the characteristics of the Latinx population of the United States, and we ought to embrace it. You can find that writers, such as Janina Brasky, to some extent, the most, Junot Diaz, working on developing a literary style that, right, is organically connected with those practices. But then I also find uses of that word right? That word associated to those linguistic practices as a pejorative reference to a marginal to a marginal way of behaving that prevents the people who engage in those practices from upward social mobility. So that's sort of my observation of how the word Spanglish is used.
So I'm going to take advantage of this last question. So if you're interested in Spanglish, Spanish in the US, if you're interested, of course, I'm going to teach a class next semester in fall 2026 that is called Latin American Spanish in the US. This class is going to be taught in English, and it's LACS, Latin American and Caribbean Studies 16J. And so I'll send information, but I will be talking about this and about many other things, about Latino identity and its relation to Spanish, among many other things. So if you're interested, just come and talk to me or send me an email. So most importantly, now is the turn for questions. So what I'm going to ask you is, if you have questions, don't be shy, because you can see that the tone was very open and very generous. And so you see those microphones there. Yeah? So if you have questions, please, again, with self-confidence, just approach the microphones and you can ask any questions that you may have. We need the microphone so that we can hear you clearly. Okay, so please don't be shy and go ahead. So who has some questions for Professor Del Valle?
Hi, my name is Kate McKevitt. I'm a joint degree student at the law school and in forensic linguistics. So thank you so much for coming today, because I'm actually in the deportation defense law clinic. So hearing you talk about the importance of multilingualism is really, it feels better to listen to, because I actually wanted to ask about your recommendation for advocates against the executive order mandating English as the official language of the United States, and how advocates can help push back against that.
Wow, that's a very difficult question.
Yeah, I know.
Question.
But you had mentioned research in the United States and attention to that, so I wanted to give you.
Yeah. Because, how to fight those executive orders currently, I have no idea how to do that. But I first want to express my admiration for language activism. It's very hard, like all activism. When you're engaging in a struggle against a very powerful adversary, you deserve admiration. What I would advise, I guess, I'm not into advising. Like, what the hell do I know? You guys know a lot more than I do. You're asking me that question. You probably know the answer to that question much better than I do. But what I would say is that if you approach the right social linguists, they will help you equip yourself with tools that will make you a better warrior in those discursive and political struggles. I think that, as I said earlier, right, language education in modernity has consisted of teaching the grammar of the standard language to all citizens. That has miserably failed, right? Also, the ideal behind that is that, okay, we teach the grammar of the standard language to all citizens, and that guarantees equality, right? So, that the evidence that project has been unsuccessful is overwhelming. So it is important to teach people how actually language works in society. And that includes the grammar of the standard language, I think we have a response. That was one of your concerns too. Oh, I absolutely think that we have to teach students the grammar of the standard language. Absolutely. But not just that. Not just that. We have to teach students how language works socially. Right? Because if we're telling them, you learn this grammar, you speak this way, and you'll be fine. That's a lie. That's a lie. Right?
Then to follow up, I wanted to go back to how you had mentioned about your interview and how you felt you came off like a professor and it would have been better if you came off more like a peer. Even colloquially, could you point out some things you wish you had done differently?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yes. I guess not so much like a peer. The question is that when we interact with other people, we adjust the way of speaking depending on, and we do that unconsciously, right? We automatically adjust the way we speak to other people because ultimately when we interact with others, I don't know, we have intent, we expect certain reactions from them, right? Even if I say, could you please open that door, right? I would expect you to walk over and open the door. So what I wish I had done differently was to be aware of the fact that I was going to talk not to talk to, but yeah, in a way, to very conservative people who are not stupid and who know certain things, have certain experiences, right? And I wish I had taken into account the fact that for people to listen to you first, they have to trust that you are honestly engaged in conversation with them. Right? Cognitive linguists know this very well. Right? If you engage in conversation with an adversary, you're not going to switch. There's no possible persuasion there. Right? So in order for someone to be able to engage in persuasion, in perhaps changing a little bit the way this other person thinks, you must gain their trust. They must feel that you're not judging or attacking them. So I wish I had taken that into account before I started answering the questions from the journalist.
I really, really appreciated that answer. It's very helpful because it's very hard to get out of the adversarial sense. And so it sounds like the answer to pushing against orders mandating English is going out into communities and talking about sociolinguistics, not just in the classroom.
Correct.
If I may also add a little bit for those who may not have taken many classes in linguistics, or maybe. So as far as the executive order that you were mentioning, that's an order that was established, whatever you want to put it, in March 2025, so a year ago. So, and it's about the idea of English being the official language of the United States. So the fact is that before that executive order, there was no official language in the United States, de jure, which in Latin means from a legal point of view. So in the Constitution doesn't say that English is the official language of the United States. However, de facto, in practice, English has always been the official language of the United States. The fathers of the Constitution decided not to establish an official language in the United States. Does anybody know why? There was another language that was very much spoken in the United States in the 18th century. Does anybody know which language was that? It could be, but there was a language that it was even stronger.
Pennsylvania and Ohio. Yeah, Pennsylvania, Ohio.
German. Absolutely. So Benjamin Franklin, for example, was complaining that the German-speaking population, they were reproducing too fast, and that, you know, the American identity, in this case, cultural nationalism, was just in danger. But the fact is the Constitution was written in English. And so that was, I think, a very good move. But in a way, English has been de facto the official language of the United States from a federal point of view. And let's remember that before the executive order in March 2025, more than 30 states in the United States, had English as the official language, among them Florida and California. And so, in a way, we need to remember that. Now, what is the reach of the executive order? So that's something that, again, you must know, as Professor Del Valle said, you must know much more. But it's important to know this, which you may find obvious, but sometimes it's important to remember this. So I just can't help asking you another question. I'm sorry, but I'm just gonna be a member of the audience in this case. So let's see. In your book, you mentioned that in Latin American studies here in the US, insufficient attention is sometimes paid to the fluency in Spanish or Portuguese, and that students may graduate with limited proficiency.
Mm-hmm.
This risks reproducing North American Anglophone perspectives on Latin America. Mm-hmm. Yet, is this trend inevitable if programs wish to attract majors and minors, or do you see alternatives?
All right. Yeah, I mean, there is a deeper problem which has to do with what's happening to the university as an institution, right? And what gets funded and what does not get funded, and the dynamics of competition that are generated among programs, right? So, hey, you go get students. Whoever gets more students is, All right, so, but that's a big, deep problem. So yes, it creates kind of an ethical question, because in order to attract the students, I don't know, you can give away candy, right? If the point is to attract students, you can hire a clown. What's crucial is to be intellectually responsible. A university that has a Latin American studies program has to face the question, what do we think should be the preparation of a North American Latin Americanist? That's the key, the central question that has to be asked. When we prepare someone to be a Latin Americanist in the United States, what should they know? Well, should that include a certain knowledge of Spanish and Portuguese, enough that you can engage in productive conversation with folks in Latin America? Right? Because the effect of not concerning ourselves with that dimension of the training is that, because of the prestige of North American universities, many Latin American scholars end up coming to the United States. In order for them to pursue successful careers, they have to publish in English, because they have to publish in the journals in the United States or in the global north. They even create journals that publish in English. And what ends up happening is that, if the perception of Colombia from the United States is violence, 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 there seems to be only one valid topic about Colombia that you can discuss: violence, right? So I see your point. And it's treacherous, really, what is happening. Having departments compete against each other. See who gets more students. Yeah, we end up giving away candy. Or joints. And so that's a big problem. I don't want to sound that I blame colleagues who try to attract students. Of course not. But we're put in that impossible position, where you need to attract the students, and you still have an ethical responsibility towards how you train those students, how you tell someone, yes, we're Hofstra University or CUNY or whatever. We give you, we credentialize your knowledge of Latin America, right? And we're not providing you with the type of training and education that we think you should have a Latin Americanist. That's a huge dilemma. It's very difficult.
No, thank you. Okay, questions? Come on in.
So I'm going to ask,
maybe not so much of an academic question, because I want to speak to the room, to the audience here, the students. The halftime show, Bad Bunny. In many ways, to me, watching that show, and I've been talking to my 12-year-old son about it, it was exactly what you talk about in this idea of politics and linguistics, and what he specifically did with Puerto Rican Spanish. And now I'm learning more as I've been watching some YouTube videos about him and how he uses language. Can you speak to, what was part of, where does the linguistics, the politics merge in that show that probably everybody in this room watched?
Yes, it was a wonderful glottopolitical scene. We call them escenas glottopolíticas.
Mm-hmm.
And my goodness, I mean, I'm sure articles and articles and articles are going to start appearing very soon in refereed journals on that episode. I think that Bad Bunny used the opportunity very intelligently to counter a representation of national identity that is being promoted by the current administration, that has white supremacist undertones, sometimes even overtones, and that legitimizes or justifies political action on the basis of defending one particular identity. So I think that he took the opportunity to counter that representation, to generate a new representation. So my reaction was one of admiration. I don't particularly care about Bad Bunny as an artist, although I acknowledge he is an artist and he has his thing, and I'm glad he's a millionaire and he's doing fine. So I think that given the circumstances, he pushed, right? He pushed the line as far as he could, right? I have to say that I mean the administration, it just gave it to him in a silver platter. I mean, the way it could have been just another halftime show. Instead, it became a huge political event. And I think that Bad Bunny, his producers, and his whole team understood very well the meaning and the political potential of the event. So he reconceptualized America, right? The word America was reconceptualized through his performance. He associated the use of Spanish and Puerto Rican culture to fairly conservative tropes such as marriage and family. Very family values the whole thing was very family values oriented, So I think he did an outstanding job at deconstructing and countering the narrative that is dominant in the current administration. And I would like to take this opportunity to say, all right, I mean, we are now witnessing an obscene, a very extreme version of this representation of America. But let's just remember a book by Samuel Huntington entitled Who Are We? Some 15, 20 years ago that was published. I don't remember the exact year. But Samuel Huntington claimed we are in danger. White Americans are in danger. And he would make he made a beautiful argument, which was, remember that we took that whole land from Mexico. They're going to want it back. They're claiming it now. Right? This has been there. Pat Buchanan, remember Pat Buchanan? Some folks may remember Pat Buchanan. He was a speechwriter for Nixon. Then he was, I think, Reagan's second administration communications director, and then he ran against Bush father, older George Bush. In around 2000, he published a book in which you had this whole idea of defending the national identity laid out. So there is a discursive matrix in a whole political organization that is not new, that comes from a few decades ago.
Okay, anything else?
All right, good afternoon. Thank you for the lecture. I wanted to talk about the Latin American community and the connotations of Spanglish, as you were talking about. Because my question was, have you seen Spanglish used as a connotation of personas que dicen, perdóname, pero no sé? And the conflicting tension between Spanish's cultural pride and continuity in Latin American communities and the necessity of English as an economical means to social mobility.
Great, thanks. I'm going to ask you to repeat the question because it's a very good question and it has several angles. So if you don't mind, read it again, please.
Yep. Have you seen Spanglish used as a connotation of personas que dicen, perdóname, pero no sé? And the conflicting tension between Spanish and as cultural pride and continuity in Latin American communities and the necessity of English as an economical means of social mobility?
Yeah, thank you. It's an excellent question. It's an excellent question because you're bringing up the whole spectrum of issues related to the social mobilization of Spanish. Of Spanglish, I'm sorry. I think that the instances in which Spanglish is used and is embraced are instances that are outside the mainstream political and economic system. So whenever Spanglish is proudly mobilized, it's someone who's acknowledging their position in some sort of margin. All right? You will find, however, just look at ads. You will find that there is an economic dimension to it. Because in advertising, competent use of Spanglish is of value. So there are instances in which someone can say, hey, listen, I have this linguistic competence. I can deploy both languages competently. I can produce an ad that is going to make certain people want to buy your product. So there is this commodification of Spanglish as well happening, right? It's being turned into a commodity, a market, a valuable product in some market. And then you have this claim that Spanish is going to help you make money, right? So there is this argument often used to say, we should embrace Spanish because if you are bilingual, you're going to make more money. There is a study conducted by Laura Villa and Lara Alonso, two colleagues of mine from CUNY, and they show that this is not true. That there is a certain type of bilingualism that is considered valuable, and guess what? It's normally white folks whose bilingualism is considered valuable, and then there is another bilingualism that is considered deficiency. They just don't speak properly either language. Now, there was one question where you said the connotations of perdóname, pero no. That I didn't understand. Can you explain that to me again?
Pero no sé, I don't know.
Yeah. But what the question, what is it that you're asking?
Okay, so let me go back to the question. So what I'm asking in that point is, sometimes in Hispanic and Latin American communities, you see that especially with parents and family members that immigrate from other countries, like I have grandparents that have all immigrated from different Spanish-speaking countries, there is a little bit of a push towards English as a beneficial means instead of fully embracing the Spanish language. You see like a conflicting choice.
Yes. So great question. Yes. Well, that seems to be changing. All right. Up until perhaps 20 years ago, it was the rule of the 3 generations. Right? So within 3 generations, the original language was gone. Jacqueline Toribio was a professor. She's Dominican, and she's a professor at University of Texas, Austin. Did very interesting research in New York, here in Long Island and Washington Heights. And she found that the Dominican community was not complying with the 3-generation rule, that Spanish persisted longer, seemed to persist longer. And she made several arguments, right? One was the social media, right? But because not social media was, because social media were not a thing yet, but the WhatsApp, I mean, what would that be? Digital technologies, right? Digital technologies facilitated being in contact with the grandparents, with relatives in the Dominican Republic, for example, right? So that was a factor that sort of changed the ecology of the language, right? And this was a very interesting finding, and of her. What was one of her theses was that Dominican, and it was a racist sort of motivation. Dominicans were resistant to being identified as black, so they would tend to retain Spanish in order to be identified as Spanish-speaking Dominicans, not black. Right? Her work is very interesting. Jacqueline Toribio, if you're interested in that topic. So, the ecology of interaction and communication is changing so much, with digital technology and artificial intelligence, that who knows, all these things that we took for granted up until recently, they may be changing. They may be changing indeed.
And if I may add, what you're describing in the last part is language insecurity. So I'm talking about generations. We may all know this, but when we talk about generation in sociolinguistics, it means, for example, I was born in Spain, so I would be a first-generation Spanish speaker. If I ever had children, they would be second generation, and if I had grandchildren, I would be third generation. The third generation rule that has been posed several times is that normally the Spanish language, or a language that is not English, would only last up to the third generation maximum. And at the fourth generation, it would be gone. So there are, these things, as you indicated, may be changing. But the problem is that when you are second generation, that's the moment in which you tend to be, definitely you will be, if you're born in the US, you will be a native speaker of English. That's something that is clear. And you may have learned Spanish at home if both your parents speak it or whatever the situation. But in the second generation, the linguistic insecurity goes up. And also, and this is very relative, but there have been some comparisons between cities, but we noticed that the level of Spanish of the second generation in cities like Miami, where Spanish has a little bit of more prestige, the level of normative Spanish, whatever that means, in the second generation is higher, or at least the security is higher. However, and Andrew Lynch, a professor at the University of Miami, has studied this, the language seems to be gone in the fourth generation as well. So just to clarify a little bit, is what I tell my students, right now I'm teaching Spanish in contact with other languages, and I'll say this next semester. The important thing is to value the language that you speak. You know, I mean, don't change into English necessarily just because someone makes faces or judges your Spanish. Your Spanish is a way of communicating, so that has the same value. Although it's true that if you're going to publish something or if you're going to look for a job, they will ask you for a certain normative Spanish that you need to learn, maybe, to get that job, but you need to be conscious that that's very relative. This is not sacred. The norms of Spanish are not sacred because there are different, from a sociolinguistic point of view, there are very different reasons for that norm. Okay, so, but the important thing I always say, may sound simple, just keep the language, use it. There's nothing wrong with that.
Thank you.
Okay, we're almost done with time. Thank you so much. I'm just gonna go to the other microphone. Thank you so much for attending, for the questions, and feel free to stay in contact and to contact Professor José del Valle and ask those questions that you still have. And if you're interested in these topics, you can always contact him or you can contact me as well. Okay, so thank you again for being here.
Thank you. Thank you all.